the North American continent faced a stark and terrifying truth. In the spring of 1942, a critical breach existed in its defenses. This vulnerability stretched across the vast, windswept expanse of the North Pacific. The Japanese incursion into the Aleutian Islands that summer was no distant skirmish. It was a direct threat. These remote outposts became potential stepping stones for a mainland assault. Existing Alaskan defenses were threadbare. Its supply lines were vulnerable. They were exposed to the relentless fury of both enemy and environment. But were they prepared for what was to come? Could anyone truly be prepared for the Aleutians? Nowhere was the brutal reality of this conflict more starkly etched than on Engineer Hill. This desolate, mud-caked rise became a crucible of unimaginable desperation. Here, the war was fought not just against an enemy, but against nature itself. The wind did not just blow, it cut like glass, it tore at exposed skin, stealing warmth. It whipped the pervasive mud into a debilitating, clinging menace. This mud sucked at boots and morale. Men endured the Aleutian stare. It was a haunted, vacant gaze born of perpetual exhaustion and gnawing squalor. Even basic survival became a triumph. This was a world away from the relative comfort of country club bases. It was a constant, grinding battle against cold, wet, and the ever-present threat of death. Against this backdrop of raw, visceral terror, the final desperate banzai charge on Engineer Hill unfolded. A wave of Japanese soldiers launched themselves into an impossible assault. They were driven by a code of honor and the grim inevitability of their situation. The air filled with the cries of men. There was the crackle of gunfire. The thud of bodies hit the unforgiving earth. It was a devastating catastrophe. It was a moment of utter ruin. It left behind not just casualties, but a lingering nightmare. This nightmare defied simplistic narratives of heroism or villainy. The aftermath was a landscape of desolation. It was marked by rusting relics and the image of a lone, resilient tree. This tree stood as a poignant, silent witness to the profound struggle. This savage intensity underscored the urgent imperative for strategic action. The war in the Pacific was consuming resources at an unprecedented rate. The newly conceived Alaska Highway, a lifeline stretching over 1,600 miles, demanded a reliable, land-based fuel supply. Its vital chain of airfields also needed fuel. Tankers were desperately needed to ferry fuel across global battlefronts. Sea transport to the remote north became a perilous and impractical luxury. Salvation, however, lay buried deep within the Canadian Northwest. For over a century, a viable, low-pour-point oil source had been known at Norman Wells. It was nestled along the Mackenzie River. This paraffin-based crude was capable of flowing even at 70 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. It presented a potential solution to the North's desperate fuel crisis. In April 1942, the U.S. War Department made a pivotal decision. They recognized the gravity of the threat and the promise of this remote oil. The Canal Project, short for Canadian Oil, was born. It was an ambitious plan to link the Norman Wells oil field to a new refinery in Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. It was a monumental commitment. It was a testament to the urgency of the war. It marked a turning point in securing vital oil resources for the defense of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. The ink was barely dry on the contracts for the Canal Project. Then, the sheer, brutal reality of the subarctic wilderness slammed into the ambitious undertaking. This was not merely a construction job. It was an invasion of an alien landscape. It was a battle against forces far more ancient and indifferent than any human enemy. The initial Japanese presence in the Aleutians forced a critical strategic decision. Those distant islands were a perceived threat. The project had to begin from the remote Norman Wells oil field. This field was deep within the Canadian Northwest. This meant abandoning the easier, dual-end approach. It meant embarking on a logistical nightmare. All initial supplies had to be pushed into the vast Mackenzie River system. The first challenge was simply getting there. How could such a monumental task even begin? An estimated 50,000 to 70,000 tons of freight had to be moved. This included pipe, heavy machinery, building materials, food, and fuel. Existing infrastructure was non-existent. Bechtel-Price-Callahan, the civilian contractors, established their base at waterways. This was the end of steel for rail transport. From there, a strange armada began to assemble. It included prefabricated wooden and later steel barges. Diesel tugs salvaged from the Missouri River were also part of it. They were ready for an 1,100-mile water trek. It was a perilous journey. It was a race against the clock of the short 5-month open water season. 16 miles of rapids at Fort Fitzgerald demanded arduous portage. Each piece of equipment had to be wrestled by hand. Sudden, violent storms plagued Great Slave Lake, the continent's fifth largest. They swallowed loads of pipe and even entire tractors and motor graders into its frigid depths. The Mackenzie River itself, though immense, was a treacherous maze. It had shallow water, shifting sandbars and swift currents. Many workers, fresh from the United States, had never seen the North before. They had certainly never navigated its unforgiving waterways. Bush planes, crucial for early reconnaissance and light transport, were grounded during the perilous freeze-up and break-up periods. This left crews utterly isolated. As the brief summer waned, the true adversary emerged. It was the subarctic winter. A stark warning posted by Bechtel-Price-Callahan in employment offices minced no words. "This is no picnic," it declared. "Working and living conditions on this job are as difficult as any ever done. Temperatures will range from 90 degrees above zero to 70 degrees below zero. Men will have to fight swamps, rivers, ice, and cold. Mosquitoes, flies, and gnats will not only be annoying but will cause bodily harm." This was no exaggeration. The sun, a low, pale orb, often remained half-hidden in the subarctic winter twilight. The mercury plummeted, frequently dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Men, often working without shelter, adapted with grim ingenuity. Convoy drivers, pioneering the nascent winter roads, took their meals along the route. They used shovels as frying pans over makeshift fires. They slept in truck cabs or bundled in eiderdowns in the middle of the road. When their heavy equipment inevitably broke down in the extreme cold, they became roadside mechanics. They improvised repairs with frozen fingers and limited tools. But beyond the physical toll, the most insidious enemy was psychological. Homesickness remained the severest hardship. It was a gnawing ache in the vast, silent isolation. Yet, despite these immediate, soul-crushing difficulties, the groundwork for the main pipeline began to take shape. The frantic push to establish critical supply lines yielded results. By February 23, 1943, the 1,000-mile Mackenzie Winter Road had been completed. It was a perilous overland artery carved through previously untouched wilderness. It allowed 9,000 tons of crucial machinery to reach Norman Wells. This happened before the spring thaw made the route impassable. The Alaska Highway, holed through as a pioneer road in late fall 1942, provided another overland route to the west. It was challenging but vital. By spring 1943, a chain of airfields had been hacked out across the Mackenzie Valley. This enabled year-round transport of men and supplies. It was a lifeline against the vast emptiness. These early phases of the canal project implicitly challenged every preconceived notion of the North. This was not a region to be easily navigated or conquered by conventional means. As the poet Robert W. Service once wrote of the North, "The mountains are nameless." He said the rivers all run God knows where. Here, settlements were few. Infrastructure was non-existent. The land itself, with its permanently frozen subsoil and treacherous muskeg, demanded specialized knowledge. It required an utterly unprecedented scale of effort. The North, once a remote blank space on the map, was now revealing its true, formidable nature. It required a pioneering spirit that would redefine the limits of human endurance and engineering. With the Japanese threat in the Aleutians contained, the strategic calculus shifted. This allowed the ambitious canal project to accelerate. No longer solely dependent on the treacherous Norman Wells approach, the enterprise could now be developed from both ends. It was a dual assault on the wilderness. Supplies flowed through the Pacific's Inside Passage and along the nascent Alaska Highway. This expansion marked a profound evolution. It transformed the project from an urgent military improvisation into a full-scale industrial endeavor. A pivotal moment arrived in August 1943. The battle hardened, yet often logistically overwhelmed. Army engineer troops were largely replaced. Civilian Bechtel-Price-Callahan crews took over. This was not merely a change in personnel. It was a fundamental shift. It unleashed the full force of American industrial might and ingenuity. The project transitioned into a focused industrial construction phase. This implicitly debunked any notion that such a complex undertaking was solely a military pursuit. These civilian contractors brought specialized expertise and refined methodologies. They had an unparalleled capacity for large-scale, rapid construction. They pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible in the far north. Yet, despite this influx of industrial power, the human element remained paramount. They battled an environment that offered no quarter. The strategic focus of the war had moved beyond the direct combat of the Aleutians, but the men and women of Canal faced their own relentless front line. The country club bases, a distant memory or myth for many, stood in stark contrast to the daily grind of the project. Here in the heart of the subarctic, men at isolated camps were well fed. Some were 520 miles from Johnson's Crossing. This was a rare luxury of wartime with no rationing. But a gnawing homesickness remained the severest hardship. Early on, many workers cultivated thick beards. It was a defiant expression of toughness against the cold and isolation. It became a silent uniform of resilience. The brutal conditions did not extinguish the spark of community, nor did they extinguish the need for companionship. A significant boost to morale and a surprising improvement in camp discipline arrived with the first women. They began working at Canal Camp and Johnson's Crossing. Their presence set an enviable example in spirit and industry. It brought a semblance of normalcy and civility to the remote outposts. In the vast, silent isolation of the line camps, men also found solace in an unexpected menagerie. Pet ducks waddled through camp. Curious foxes and squirrels became regular visitors. Even a majestic eagle found companionship among the temporary residents. These small, wild bonds offered a poignant counterpoint to the monumental scale of the engineering task. As the year drew to a close, one of the project's most formidable challenges neared its triumphant conclusion. The Canal Road was a critical supporting artery. It was carved through the Mackenzie Mountains, across the treeless expanse of Macmillan Pass, and through the treacherous Dodo Canyon. It was almost complete. On December 30th, 1943, only 7.5 miles remained. All night long, in the bitter cold, the roar of bulldozers echoed across the frozen landscape. They struggled through deep snowdrifts. By the dawn of December 31st, 1943, the entire Canal Road was finally made passable. This transformed supply logistics for the pipeline construction. It established a vital new overland supply route on the very rim of the Arctic. Even after its completion, the road demanded constant vigilance. Telephone crews quickly followed, laying lines to connect all camps by February 1944. This created a lifeline of communication. Violent and prolonged storms frequently tied up traffic for hours or even days. But the road was always cleared. The trucks, laden with the sinews of war, rolled through. It was an unyielding testament to human determination. The roar of heavy machinery, a constant companion for nearly 2 years, had begun to recede. It was replaced by a new, expectant hum across the vast sub-Arctic. From the first desperate reconnaissance flights to the final push through Dodo Canyon, the Canal project had been a relentless battle. It was against an indifferent wilderness. It was a monumental gamble to secure the fuel lifeline for a continent at war. Now, after 20 months and 4 days of unyielding effort, the finish line was in sight. On February 16, 1944, a quiet convergence of men took place. It was somewhere along the nearly 1,000-mile stretch of newly laid pipe. There was no grand ceremony, no brass band, no high-ranking dignitaries. Instead, it was the truck drivers and the catskinners, the welders and the pipe fitters who gathered. These were the very men who had wrestled this steel serpent into submission. They stood in the bitter cold, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Their faces were etched with the fatigue of countless sunrises and sunsets in the north. Yet they were alight with a shared understanding. This was the moment of the golden weld. It was the final connection. A crucial seam bound together the last few hundred feet of the main crude oil pipeline. As the arc hissed and flared, casting stark shadows against the snow, it was more than just metal joining metal. It was the culmination of every frozen finger, every improvised repair, every mile of treacherous road carved from the bush. It was a silent, profound triumph. It was a testament to raw human will against the unyielding forces of nature and the urgent demands of global conflict. With the pipeline physically complete, the focus shifted to operationalization. 2 months later, in April 1944, the deep chill of the North began its slow retreat. With it, the first lifeblood of the project began to pulse. Crude oil, the paraffin-based treasure from Norman wells, commenced its journey. It was propelled by 10 powerful pumping stations. Each was equipped with 3 diesel engines. These engines were capable of running on the very crude they transported. The dark liquid snaked its way across the frozen land, through the Mackenzie Mountains and finally into the gleaming new Whitehorse refinery. The crude oil furnace stack and the towering fractionating column now truly stood as symbols of triumph. They were pieced together from surplus parts and idle mills. The hum of the refinery, a new sound in the Yukon wilderness, signaled that the canal system was fully operational. It was ready to convert raw crude into the gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel so desperately needed. The strategic implications were immediate and profound. The canal project, often derided as a costly and challenging endeavor, had delivered. It had successfully established a critical and secure fuel supply line for the North American theater. It directly bolstered Alaska's defense capabilities. It facilitated the vital movement of aircraft across the North Pacific, but its legacy stretched far beyond the immediate exigencies of war. It had pried open thousands of square miles of previously uncharted and undeveloped country. It shattered the long-held myth of an eternally frigid, barren, and inhospitable North. It proved that modern industrial science, married with an indomitable pioneering spirit, could not only survive but thrive in extreme environmental conditions. The project stood as an enduring monument to the extraordinary cooperation between individuals, civilian industries, and the governments of the United States and Canada. It forged bonds and demonstrated a capacity for large-scale, rapid construction. This redefined the boundaries of what was thought possible in the far north. The oil flowed, a dark, pulsing testament to human will. But the true legacy of the canal project stretched far beyond the immediate strategic victory. It was a project that did not just build pipelines and roads, it fundamentally reshaped the very perception of the North American subarctic. It shattered myths as surely as bulldozers carved through permafrost. For centuries, the vast Canadian Northwest, particularly the Mackenzie District and Yukon Territory, had been dismissed. It was seen as an eternally frigid, barren, and inhospitable wilderness. It was a land for intrepid explorers and resilient indigenous peoples, but not for large-scale modern development. Camel proved otherwise. The collective testimony of thousands of workers, men and women from diverse USA, states and Canada, revealed a profound truth. The subarctic, while challenging, was not inherently malevolent. Despite the warnings of no picnic and the constant battle against mosquitoes and black flies, the project's effective safety programs meant something remarkable. There were no reported maulings by wild animals. There were no severe frostbite cases. There were no climate-specific fatalities. In fact, the climate proved surprisingly healthful. The sprawling camps, which began as mere tents and evolved into complex barracks and shops, demonstrated that comfortable living was not only possible but achievable. Good roads, telephone lines, airports, pipelines, refineries, and even nascent towns could be built and sustained there. Canal did not just conquer the North, it domesticated it. It proved that modern machinery and infrastructure, married with an indomitable pioneering spirit, could thrive even in the most extreme environmental conditions. It had, in essence, pried open thousands of square miles of previously uncharted and undeveloped country. It laid crucial groundwork for future exploration and joint Canadian-US development. This was a vast and rich hinterland that had long been considered economically unviable. Beyond the physical transformation of the landscape, Canal stood as a monumental testament to extraordinary cooperation and human ingenuity. It was forged in the crucible of wartime. It quickly earned a reputation as the greatest construction job since the Panama Canal. It was destined to be the biggest construction program in the history of the world. This was in terms of sheer area covered, the speed of its accomplishment, and the pioneering spirit it demanded. This was not merely construction. It was an act of redefinition. It pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible in engineering and resource development. The necessity of improvising repairs in temperatures so low that metal became brittle was one example. The sheer audacity of carving an entire road across the unexplored Mackenzie-Yukon divide was another. The ingenious sourcing of refinery components from idle mills and surplus parts were all hallmarks of this project. It constantly adapted and innovated. Crucially, Camel fostered an unprecedented level of cooperation. This ranged from the initial consent of the Canadian government to the day-to-day interactions between U.S. Army engineer troops and civilian Bechtel-Price-Callahan crews. The project was a shared endeavor. It forged enduring friendships among the individuals who toiled side by side in the isolation. They operated heavy machinery in the bitter cold or navigated treacherous waterways. This collaboration extended to the highest levels of government. It led to closer bilateral relations between the United States and Canada. It demonstrated a capacity for large-scale, rapid construction. This redefined not just what was possible in the far north, but the very scope of global construction efforts. The crude oil furnace stack and the towering fractionating column, now humming with purpose in Whitehorse, stood not just as symbols of fuel production, they stood as enduring monuments to the triumph of modern industrial science. They were monuments to the unyielding human spirit in the face of an untamed frontier.